Sarah sat at the kitchen table, running her fingers along the rim of her wine glass. The silence between her and James had stretched thin over the years, but tonight it felt heavier, pregnant with something unsaid. The soft glow of the pendant light overhead barely touched the shadows in his face. His gaze flickered toward her, hesitation clear in his eyes. "I want to try something new," he said finally, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Sarah raised an eyebrow, setting her wine down. "New how?" James leaned forward, elbows on the table, his expression unreadable. "A club," he said, his voice carefully measured. "A place where couples explore." The word hung between them, wrapping around Sarah's thoughts like a slow-moving fog. She knew what he meant before he even said it. They had joked about it once, drunken whispers in bed, both of them tipsy on cheap wine and the illusion of rekindled passion. But now, in the sobering light of their kitchen, it wasn't a joke. "You're serious?" she asked, forcing out a dry laugh. He nodded. "I think it could be good for us." The suggestion lodged itself deep in her chest, a dull pressure she couldn't quite name. 8 years of marriage, a handful of which had been full of fire. But now they felt more like cohabitants than lovers, orbiting each other without collision. She searched his face for something. Assurance, excitement, maybe even doubt. Instead, she found only determination. "You think sleeping with strangers will fix us?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. James didn't flinch. "I think breaking the routine might." Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. "And if I say no?" His jaw tightened, but he exhaled, his voice even. "Then we don't go. But at least think about it." She did. For 3 days, she turned it over in her mind, the idea evolving from absurd to dangerous to strangely intriguing. She caught herself watching James differently, trying to see him as someone else might. Someone meeting him for the first time, someone who didn't know his habits, his faults, his predictable sighs at the end of the day. On the 4th night, she agreed. The drive was silent except for the soft hum of the radio. Sarah stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker past, neon reflections stretching along rain-slicked streets. Her heartbeat was an unsteady rhythm beneath her skin, a mix of anticipation and unease. James drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh. He looked calm, too calm. "You've looked this place up before, haven't you?" she asked suddenly. His fingers flexed against the steering wheel. "A little." "How long have you been thinking about this?" James hesitated. "A while." The answer shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. A tight knot formed in her stomach, twisting into something dangerously close to betrayal. She turned back to the window, focusing on the city beyond the glass. When they pulled up to the club, Sarah felt her breath hitch. It wasn't what she expected. No flashing lights, no seedy entrance. Instead, it was discreet, tucked between 2 high-end boutiques, the entrance marked only by a black door and a gold-plated plaque that read Lux Noir. James cut the engine and turned to her. "Are you ready?" She wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and candle wax. The lighting was low, casting the space in warm gold and deep crimson. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor as they stepped inside, her fingers instinctively reaching for James's arm. A woman approached them, her figure draped in a black silk gown that shimmered as she moved. Her hair was an elegant cascade of waves, her lips painted a deep, knowing red. "You must be new," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "I'm Olivia. Welcome to Lux Noir." James shook her hand first, but Olivia's eyes were already on Sarah, assessing, measuring. "First time?" she asked. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "No need to be nervous," Olivia assured her. "Everything here is about trust, exploration, and most importantly, choice." The word settled in Sarah's mind, heavy and unspoken. She forced a smile, but her pulse quickened as Olivia gestured toward the main lounge. Through the arched doorway, Sarah saw glimpses of strangers in intimate conversation, fingers tracing along bare skin, stolen glances charged with unspoken promises. A flicker of heat rose in her chest. Whether from anxiety or something else, she wasn't sure. He turned to James. His eyes weren't on her anymore. They were on a woman across the room, dark-haired, elegant, laughing softly into her champagne glass. Something in Sarah snapped into place. A realization, cold and sharp. This night wasn't about saving them. It was about setting them free. The club pulsed with an unspoken rhythm, an undercurrent of desire woven into the air like perfume. Sarah's heels felt heavier now, her body hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered conversation she couldn't quite make out. The people here weren't mindless or reckless. There was a refinement to the way they moved, a deliberate quality that made the setting feel less like a wild indulgence and more like an art form. James walked a step ahead of her. His posture relaxed in a way that made her stomach twist. He wasn't nervous. He belonged here. The realization dug deep. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly as Olivia led them through the lounge. Her movements fluid and practiced, like a conductor guiding them into the symphony of the night. "We encourage connection," Olivia said smoothly, her voice carrying an air of authority, "but only within the boundaries you set. Trust is everything here." Sarah nearly scoffed at that. What boundaries had already been broken without her knowledge? She stole a glance at James, but he was still looking past her, past everything, at the woman in the sleek black dress across the room. It was then that Sarah understood. He had been planning this long before tonight. Something in her cooled. "This way," Olivia continued, gesturing toward an opulent lounge area with plush seating and dim lighting. "Get comfortable, have a drink. When you're ready, you'll know. When you're ready, you'll know." Sarah wasn't sure she would ever be ready. But as James drifted toward the bar, leaving her standing alone, she knew she had two choices: fall in line with his fantasy or rewrite the rules entirely. She turned away from him. The stranger. Sarah moved toward a quiet corner of the lounge, pretending to study the room as if she belonged. She could feel eyes on her, assessing, curious, but she kept her expression unreadable. If James was playing a game, then she would too. And then she saw him. A man leaned casually against the bar. His posture both effortless and commanding. He wasn't like the others. There was no pretension in the way he held himself, no arrogant display of wealth or expectation. His suit was well-tailored but understated. His dark hair just slightly tousled, as if he hadn't planned to end up here but had decided to stay anyway. His gaze met hers, and something shifted in the air. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips before he turned back to his drink. An invitation. Sarah's feet moved before she could question herself. She reached the bar just as the bartender slid a glass of deep red wine in front of her. She hadn't ordered it. The man beside her tilted his glass toward hers in a quiet toast. "I took a guess," he said. His voice was smooth, rich. The kind that could make a conversation feel like a slow unraveling. Sarah arched an eyebrow but lifted her glass anyway. The first sip was cool, grounding. "You guessed correctly," she admitted, glancing at him. He turned fully to face her now, studying her in a way that didn't feel intrusive, just perceptive. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys being someone's second choice." The words landed with a precision that made her chest tighten. She should have been offended. But instead, she found herself exhaling, as if he had simply spoken a truth she had been unwilling to admit. Sarah set her glass down. "And you don't seem like someone who comes here for the same reason as everyone else." His smile deepened. "Maybe I don't." A pause stretched between them, charged and deliberate. Sarah glanced across the room and caught sight of James. He was laughing now, leaning in too closely to the woman in the black dress, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Her stomach clenched, but this time it wasn't with pain. It was clarity. She turned back to the stranger. "What's your name?" "Daniel." She let the name settle in her mind before offering her own. "Sarah." Daniel's gaze flickered to James, then back to her. He didn't ask if she was here alone. He already knew the answer. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that she had to tilt her head to hear him. "Tell me, Sarah, Are you here to stay loyal or to get even? She inhaled sharply. The question shouldn't have been so difficult to answer. But it was. Sarah held Daniel's gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her wine glass. His question lingered between them, heavy with implication. Are you here to stay loyal or to get even? She should have had an answer. The moment James led her into this place, she should have drawn a line in her mind, set a rule for herself, determined what she would and wouldn't allow. But as she stood here, watching her husband whisper to another woman while pretending she wasn't even in the room, the boundaries she had once clung to blurred at the edges. Daniel didn't press her for a response. He only watched, studying her with the quiet confidence of a man who already knew which way the night would unfold. Sarah exhaled, setting her glass down with careful precision. What if I don't know? A slow smile curved at the corner of Daniel's lips. Then maybe that's the real reason you came here. His voice had a weight to it, not just flirtation but understanding. It startled her. He didn't see her as some wife looking for revenge, nor as someone reluctantly dragged along by a thrill-seeking husband. He saw something else, something she wasn't even sure she recognized in herself yet. Sarah glanced toward James again, but he didn't even notice. He was too busy tracing the rim of his glass while the woman in black leaned into his space, her laugh soft and knowing. A bitter laugh caught in Sarah's throat. The irony was suffocating. She had spent so long trying to keep their marriage steady, convincing herself that their growing distance was just a phase, that James still saw her the way he once did. But he had been planning this for months. She turned back to Daniel. How does this work? His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, an almost imperceptible movement, like he had been waiting for her to ask. You mean the club? He asked. Sarah hesitated. Oh, mean this, you and me. If I said yes. Daniel leaned in just slightly, not touching her, not crossing any invisible line, but close enough that the heat between them was undeniable. It works however you want it to, he said. No expectations. No obligations. Sarah swallowed. Her pulse was an erratic rhythm in her throat. She had spent years making careful choices, choosing stability over spontaneity, trust over temptation. But now, standing here in the dim glow of a world where the rules no longer applied, she felt something shift inside her. She wanted to know what it was like to be wanted again. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but because someone saw her, really saw her, and chose her anyway. Daniel reached for his drink, taking a slow sip before setting it down. Walk with me, he said. It wasn't a command, just an offer. A door left slightly ajar. Sarah hesitated for only a second before stepping through it. The game begins. They moved through the club's corridors, away from the main lounge, the sound of low conversation and muffled laughter fading behind them. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound too loud in the quiet tension between them. Daniel didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The awareness of his presence beside her was enough. They stopped near a secluded alcove, a space lined with deep velvet seating, half hidden from the rest of the room. Daniel turned to face her, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other reaching to tuck an unruly strand of hair behind her ear. Sarah inhaled sharply. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but it sent a current through her, something dangerously close to surrender. You're thinking too much, Daniel murmured. Sarah let out a soft, breathless laugh. Maybe. Tell me what you want. His voice was a quiet challenge. Sarah closed her eyes for half a second, blocking out the club, the sound of clinking glasses, the knowledge that her husband was somewhere nearby, making his own choices. What did she want? To hurt James the way he had hurt her? Maybe. To prove that she was still desirable? Perhaps. But as she opened her eyes and met Daniel's gaze, she realized the truth was far simpler. She just wanted to feel something. Her lips parted, words forming on the tip of her tongue. A voice cut through the air, sharp and unexpected. Sarah. She froze. James stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his gaze flicking from her to Daniel. Something passed between them, something unspoken, taut as a wire stretched too thin. For the first time that night, Sarah saw something in James's eyes that hadn't been there before. Panic. He had assumed she would play the role he had assigned her, the hesitant wife, the reluctant observer. He had never expected her to be a participant. Sarah met his gaze, holding it steady, and for the first time in years she felt like she had the upper hand.